I thought I had a good marriage. Not perfect but solid. My husband Mark and I had been together for 10 years, building our lives side by side. We worked hard, made smart financial choices, and kept our money separate, but always contributed equally. It was a system that worked, or so I thought. His family, though, that was another story. They were the definition of a financial disaster. His parents, his older brother, his sister-in-law, every single one of them had money problems. Maxed out credit cards, bad investments, constant personal loans they never repaid. But Mark always assured me we would never mix finances with them. And I believed him. Until the family meeting. Mark told me his parents wanted us at their house for an important discussion. He said his father had some big announcement and the whole family needed to be there. I wasn't thrilled. I already knew it would involve money, complaints, or some new crisis, but I agreed. I figured it would be another long afternoon of listening to them argue over who owed what and who needed a loan this time. But the second we arrived, I knew something was off. They were already sitting in the living room waiting. The air felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. Mark and I sat down, and his father, Richard, stood up like he was about to deliver a grand speech. He cleared his throat, looking around the room dramatically. "We've all been talking," he began, "and we've come up with a plan that will benefit everyone." I should have left right then. His mother, Carol, smiled at me, a saccharine, condescending look that made my stomach tighten. "We know you've been very fortunate with your savings," she said, like she was complimenting a child. I glanced at Mark. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "We've drawn up a contract," his brother Dan announced, pulling out a thick stack of papers from a folder. "To make things fair." Fair. My gut twisted. Dan handed me the document like he was offering a gift. I flipped through the pages, my heart pounding harder with each line I read. They were asking me to transfer all of my savings into a family account that Richard would manage. Their reasoning? Since I had been fortunate enough to build a solid financial foundation, it was only right to redistribute it so the entire family could benefit. I laughed. Out loud. Because there was no way they were serious. "You can't be serious," I said, shaking my head. Richard gave me a patient, almost pitying smile. "Oh, we are." Dan crossed his arms. "It's time for everyone to contribute. You're part of this family, and family supports each other." I turned to Mark, expecting him to shut this down immediately. But he still wouldn't look at me. That's when the laughter died in my throat. This wasn't just his family's plan. He knew. I felt something inside me snap. I tossed the papers back onto the table. "There is no way I'm signing this." That's when Richard sighed heavily, like he was disappointed in me. Then, without a word, he walked to the front door and locked it. Carol's smile widened, still sickly sweet. "We really hoped you'd just sign it," she said, "but if you need time to reconsider, that's fine too." Dan picked up the contract and placed it back in my lap. "Read it again." Carefully. I looked around. Everyone was watching me. Waiting. And that's when I realized this was planned. The locked door, the rehearsed lines, the way Mark had said nothing. He wasn't blindsided. He was in on it. My hands curled into fists. They thought they had trapped me. They thought locking the door would scare me, that the pressure would make me fold. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Slowly I reached into my purse. Their smug faces told me they thought I was getting a pen. Instead, I pulled out my own folder. And when I calmly set my own documents on the table, their smiles vanished. Because I didn't come unprepared. And what I had would tear their world apart. For a long moment, no one spoke. The energy in the room shifted, their smug expressions flickering into confusion as they stared at the folder I had just placed on the table. I could see their minds racing, trying to process what was happening. Richard narrowed his eyes, his tone sharp. "What is this?" I leaned back in my chair, letting the tension stretch, enjoying the slight flicker of uncertainty in his voice. "Divorce papers," I said, my voice steady. Mark's head snapped up so fast I thought he might give himself whiplash. His entire body stiffened, his eyes wide with pure disbelief. "Wait, what?" His voice cracked slightly, and for the first time that night, I saw real panic in his expression. I turned to face him fully, meeting his eyes with nothing but cold resolve. I knew something was off when you insisted on keeping our finances separate all these years, I said evenly. I knew your family always came first for you. But this. I gestured toward the contract they had tried to make me sign. This proves everything. Mark's face turned red, his hands clenching into fists. Babe, come on, let's talk about this in private. No, I said, my voice sharp. I jabbed a finger at the divorce papers. You're going to sign those today. Carol's fake smile finally wavered. Now, wait just a minute, dear. No, you wait a minute, I snapped, turning my gaze on her. You thought you could lock me in here and pressure me into handing over my savings? You thought I wouldn't see right through this? Richard's jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the armrest of his chair. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head like I was some rebellious child refusing to listen to reason. You're making a huge mistake, he said slowly, his voice now dangerously low. If you walk out that door, you won't be welcome here again. I smirked, tilting my head. Oh no, I said, mock horror dripping from my voice. How will I ever recover? Dan let out a bitter laugh, his sneer deepening. You think you're so smart, don't you? But Mark's not signing anything. He's not that stupid. I turned to Mark, who was still staring at the divorce papers like they were covered in poison. You will sign, I told him, my voice calm but unshakable. His eyes finally snapped up to mine. Are you threatening me? I leaned in slightly, my voice dropping just enough for only him to hear. No, Mark, I said softly, I'm warning you. The silence in the room was deafening. Mark swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I could tell he wasn't expecting this. He thought I would panic. He thought I would cry, that I would beg him to reconsider, that I would be too shocked to fight back. But now, looking at me, he knew he had lost control. But I wasn't finished. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into my folder again. Dan scoffed. Oh, what now? I smiled coldly. Just a little something extra. I pulled out a second stack of papers, this one thicker than the divorce papers. I placed it on top of the contract they had tried to force me to sign. Mark's eyes flickered to the new stack, confusion crossing his face. What is this? He asked hesitantly. I turned my gaze toward the rest of the family, speaking slowly. Would you all like to know how Mark has been withdrawing money from your accounts over the years? The shift in the room was instantaneous. Richard sat forward. What the hell are you talking about? Carol's eyes darted between Mark and me, uncertainty creeping into her expression. Dan let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. Nice try. Mark wouldn't, but I cut him off. Wouldn't he? I tapped the papers. Because I have proof. And if you really want to test me, I'll happily take this to the police. The room was so silent you could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Carol let out a quiet gasp, covering her mouth. Mark shot up from his chair, his face ghostly pale. That's a lie, he shouted, his voice shaking. I crossed my arms, unbothered. Is it? I lifted a brow. Because I have bank statements, transfer logs, fake investments. Want me to read out some of the transactions? Let's start with the $15,000 that went missing from Dan's savings account 3 years ago. Dan's entire body stiffened. He ripped the papers off the table and scanned them, his eyes widening as he flipped through the pages. His hands tightened around the documents, his breath quickening. No way, he muttered. His voice broke on the last word. He looked up, his face twisted in rage. You bastard. Mark stepped back, panicked. Dan, I can explain. But before he could finish, Richard snatched the papers from Dan's hands. He scanned the documents, his jaw tightening with every second that passed. Then, his face darkened. Is this why my business loan got denied? Richard said, his voice dangerously low. Because you emptied the emergency fund? Carol let out a choked sob. You told me you needed that money to help pay off our mortgage, she wailed, her face contorted in disbelief. Mark looked like a trapped animal. Dan shoved his chair back, rising to his feet so quickly it scraped against the floor. His hands were clenched into fists. You took my money. My kid's money. You said you were investing it for me. Mark's whole body went stiff. Dan, I swear I was going to Save it? Dan's voice was pure venom. And then, chaos erupted. Richard started shouting, Carol was crying, Dan looked like he wanted to punch something. Mark was frantically trying to explain himself, but no one was listening anymore. I sat back and watched, because I had known for a while that Mark had been lying. Not just to me but to everyone. The money transfers were too shady. The stories never added up. And after some digging, I found the truth. Mark had been robbing his own family blind. And now, they knew it too. Mark's world had just collapsed in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His own family, the same people he had expected to blindly support him, were now turning on him. His father's face was purple with rage, his mother sobbing into her hands, and his brother clenching his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. Dan was still staring at the bank statements, his eyes flicking from one line to the next, as if he were trying to wake up from a nightmare. You stole from me. His voice was low, dangerous. Mark took a stumbling step back. No, it's not like that. I was going to pay you back. Dan let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Pay me back. He slammed the papers onto the table. With what? You're broke, Mark. Richard, who had been silent for a full minute, suddenly spoke. His voice was calm but deadly. Mark, he said, is this why my business account has been empty? Mark's face twitched. Richard stood up slowly, setting the papers down with careful precision. His entire demeanor had changed. No longer the arrogant patriarch, no longer the man who had been so eager to pressure me into handing over my money. Now he was just a man who had realized his own son had betrayed him. Answer me, Richard demanded, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. Mark opened his mouth. No words came out. Richard took a slow step forward. Is this why my business loan was denied? His voice boomed, making even Carol flinch. Did you steal from me too? Mark froze. His lips parted, but no excuses came out this time. Because he knew he couldn't talk his way out of this. That's when he made his last desperate move. Mark spun toward me. This is your fault, he screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. I laughed. Loudly. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I personally go into your family's bank accounts and steal money? I crossed my arms. Or was that you? Mark was unraveling fast. You set me up. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, so I somehow forced you to drain your family's savings? I made you commit fraud? I made you lie for years? He was breathing hard now, his entire body shaking. You ruined everything. Richard exhaled sharply. No, son, he said, his voice dripping with disappointment. You did this to yourself. Carol sobbed harder. My baby, how could you? Don't call me that. Mark suddenly snapped at his mother, his voice cracking. Dan moved. He was on Mark in a second, grabbing him by the front of his shirt, shoving him back against the wall so hard that a framed picture rattled. You stole from my kids, Dan snarled, his face inches from Mark's. Do you even understand what you've done? Mark tried to push him off. I can fix this. I snorted. Oh really? With what money, Mark? Because it looks like you've already burned through all of theirs. Richard suddenly stepped forward. That's enough. Dan, breathing hard, hesitated for a second, then shoved Mark away like he was something filthy. Mark staggered, his eyes darting around wildly, but there was nowhere left to run. And then, just when I thought he had finally given up, Mark did something truly pathetic. He turned back to me. Babe, please, he whispered, his entire demeanor changing in an instant. Gone was the anger, the accusations, the screaming. Now he looked small, desperate. You don't have to do this, he begged. We can fix this. Together. Dan let out a harsh laugh. Wow. You really are a piece of work. Carol reached for him, her voice breaking. Mark, we'll figure this out, sweetheart, but you need to. And no. Richard suddenly snapped at her. Everyone froze. Richard's face was unreadable, but when he looked at Mark, there was no softness left. I'm pressing charges. For a second, no one moved. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, like the walls had closed in. Mark stared at his father, his face frozen, like his brain was refusing to process what had just been said. You're pressing charges? His voice came out small, barely above a whisper. Richard's jaw tightened, his hands clenched at his sides. Yes. Dan nodded sharply, his face still twisted in anger. So am I. Carol let out a horrified gasp, clutching her chest like she had been stabbed. You can't do that. He's your son. Your brother. Richard didn't even look at her. And he's also a thief. Mark took a stumbling step back, his chest heaving. Dad, you don't mean that. Richard's gaze was ice cold. I've never meant anything more in my life. Dan folded his arms. You stole from us, Mark. You expect us to just forget that? Mark's face twitched, his mouth opening and closing like he was searching for the right words, for the perfect excuse. I can fix this, he whispered, his voice cracking. I can get the money back. I snorted, crossing my arms. With what? Another scam? His head snapped toward me, his eyes wild, desperate. This is your fault, he hissed. I let out a sharp laugh. Oh, so I forced you to steal from your own family? That was me. His hands curled into fists. You set me up. No, Mark, Richard interrupted, his voice deadly calm. You set yourself up. Carol shook her head frantically, tears spilling down her cheeks. Please, Richard, we can work this out as a family. Richard finally turned to face her, and when he spoke, his voice was calm but firm. A family? He let out a dry laugh. That's funny, Carol, because Mark stole from this family. He lied to us for years. And you want us to just, what? Pretend it didn't happen? Yes, she blurted out. Dan let out a harsh scoff, shaking his head. Mark grabbed my arm suddenly, his grip tight, almost painful. Please, he whispered, his voice shaking. I ripped my arm away, taking a deliberate step back. Don't touch me. His face crumbled. I love you, he pleaded, his voice breaking completely. I tilted my head. Really? Because I don't remember love involving financial manipulation and fraud. Mark dropped to his knees. Literally. Right there, on the living room floor in front of everyone. Please, he begged, his hands gripping my ankles. Don't do this. Carol started sobbing harder, covering her face with her hands. Dan rolled his eyes. Are you seriously pulling this pathetic act right now? Richard let out a slow breath. I've seen enough. Then, in one single move, he pulled out his phone. Mark froze. Dad, what are you doing? Calling the police. Mark froze, his hands still gripping my ankles like some kind of desperate lifeline. His whole body tensed, his breathing shallow, his face pale. Dad, put the phone down. His voice shook, barely above a whisper. Richard didn't even hesitate. He pressed the call button. Yes, I need to report a case of financial fraud and identity theft. The suspect is present. His voice was calm, detached, like he was talking about a stranger. Mark's entire body convulsed. He let out a choked sound, somewhere between a sob and a growl, and lunged forward, reaching for the phone. Dan was faster. He stepped in, shoving Mark back so hard he nearly fell onto the coffee table. Don't even try it. Mark staggered, panic flooding his expression. He turned to Carol, wild-eyed. Mom, do something. Carol was frozen, hands covering her mouth, her entire body shaking. They won't really do this, Mark muttered, shaking his head, his voice bordering on hysteria. They're bluffing. They wouldn't actually. A sharp knock at the front door. The entire room went still. Mark's face drained of color. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his eyes darting toward the door like it was his executioner. Richard didn't even look at him. He simply walked over and pulled the door open. And there they were. 2 uniformed police officers. Who called it in? One of them asked. Richard stepped aside. I did. The suspect is my son. Mark let out a sharp gasp, stumbling back like he had been physically hit. Dad. No. Please. His voice was so small now, completely broken. The officers stepped inside, their expressions unreadable. Mark Richardson? Mark nodded numbly, his hands trembling. You're under arrest for financial fraud, identity theft, and unauthorized use of funds, the officer continued. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back. Mark didn't move. He was frozen, his mouth opening and closing, like his brain simply couldn't comprehend what was happening. This isn't real, he whispered, shaking his head. Dan scoffed. Oh, it's real all right. The officers grabbed his arms, spinning him around before he could even react. The click of the handcuffs echoed through the living room. Carol let out a strangled wail, collapsing onto the couch. You can't do this, she sobbed. This is a misunderstanding. Please just talk to him. Richard let out a bitter laugh. Talk to him? Like he talked to us before stealing from us. Mark started struggling, his breath ragged, erratic. Wait, please. His voice was high-pitched, desperate. I stepped forward, tilting my head. What's wrong, Mark? I thought you said they were bluffing? His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time all night, I saw pure, unfiltered hatred behind the panic. You, he spat, his voice shaking with rage. You did this to me. I smirked. No, Mark. You did this to yourself. The officers grabbed his arms, leading him toward the door. No. Help me. Mark was kicking, fighting, his voice cracking with every word. Carol rushed forward, reaching for him. My baby. Please, he didn't mean it. Dan stepped between them. Mom, don't. He's not the victim here. Mark's eyes darted around wildly, searching for someone, anyone, who would help him. No one did. Not his father. Not his mother. Not his brother. Not me. As the officers dragged him out the front door, I heard his final, pathetic scream before it was cut off by the sound of a car door slamming shut. And just like that, he was gone. The room fell completely silent. For the first time since I had walked into that house, I felt the weight lift off my chest. I turned to Richard, watching him stare at the front door like he was processing the past 10 years of his life. You okay? I asked. He let out a slow, shaky breath. I will be. Dan crossed his arms, shaking his head. Good riddance. Carol said nothing. She simply stood there, staring at the floor, completely broken. I let out a small sigh, grabbing my purse. Well, this was fun. Dan let out a dry laugh. You're a savage, you know that? I grinned. You have no idea. And with that, I walked out of that house for the last time. I had won. But I knew. Mark wasn't done yet. I should have known Mark wouldn't go down without one last, pathetic attempt at revenge. For a while things were quiet, too quiet. The divorce was moving forward, my lawyer was handling everything, and I was finally beginning to breathe again. Mark was locked up, facing fraud charges, and his family? They had gone completely silent. No calls. No messages. No last-minute attempts to guilt-trip me. It was like I had finally cut them out of my life for good. Until one night my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I ignored. Eat. Then it buzzed again. And again. Finally, a text. You think you won? You have no idea what's coming. I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice. I knew exactly who it was. Mark. Oh, he was in jail. He shouldn't have access to a phone. But Mark always had backup plans, little ways to squirm out of accountability. I forwarded the message to my lawyer immediately, and he called me within minutes. He's desperate, he said. Ignore it. Do not respond. So I didn't. But I should have known, he wasn't done yet. A week later I got a call from my bank. Ma'am, we need to verify a transaction request for your account. I sat up straight. What transaction? A wire transfer request for $75,000. My stomach dropped. I never authorized that. That's what we thought, the banker said. It was flagged because the request came from a device that isn't registered to you. Mark. He was trying to drain my money from jail. I acted fast. Within hours, my lawyer froze all my accounts, set up new security layers, and launched an investigation. The answer? A smuggled phone. Mark had been using someone on the outside to try and access my accounts. It was desperate. It was sloppy. And it was his biggest mistake yet. Because the next morning I got a very satisfying phone call. Mark was caught attempting to commit additional fraud from inside the jail, my lawyer said, barely containing his amusement. The DA is tacking on new charges. I laughed. This idiot had already been caught once and he still thought he could get away with it? But the real kicker? Because of this new crime, Mark's original plea deal was revoked. Instead of serving 5 years, he was now facing 10. I could only imagine the look on his face when he found out. The sheer panic. The realization that he had just destroyed his own chances of ever getting out early. A few days later, I got one last message from him. I almost didn't check it. But curiosity won. You ruined my life. But this isn't over. I smiled. Oh, Mark. It was so over. Mark thought his pathetic last-ditch attempt at revenge would shake me. He thought his threats, his desperate message, his stolen access to my accounts would make me afraid. Instead, it just made me angrier. I wasn't about to let him haunt me from prison. I wasn't about to let him keep any kind of power over me, not after everything he had already tried. If he thought I was just going to sit back and let him continue scheming, he had no idea who he was messing with. I called my lawyer the next morning. I want to make sure he never has access to anything connected to me ever again. I was hoping you'd say that, he replied. And that's when I dropped the hammer. First, we secured a full restraining order. One that didn't just prevent him from contacting me, but also blocked him from accessing anything tied to my name. If he so much as tried to ask about me through a third party, he'd be violating the order. If he tried to send another message from prison, straight back to solitary confinement. Then we dug deeper into his accounts. Turns out, Mark wasn't just scamming his family, he had been involved in even more financial crimes than we initially thought. His hidden bank account, the one he had been funneling stolen money into, it wasn't just set up in my name. It had connections to fraudulent business deals, tax evasion, and fake investment schemes. Which meant one thing, the IRS got involved. I didn't even have to do anything. The second my lawyer notified the right people, the government took over. They started freezing assets, seizing accounts, and unraveling every single illegal move Mark had ever made. And then, they hit him with federal charges. That's right. Not just local fraud charges. Not just identity theft. Federal fraud charges. Which meant that his already increased 10-year sentence turned into 25. He wasn't just going to prison. He was going away for decades. And the best part? Every single stolen dollar that was in that secret account? Since it was legally under my name, I was able to claim every last cent. I didn't just destroy him. I took everything. The house. Sold it for a profit. The car? Liquidated. His assets. Completely wiped out. Mark would leave prison someday, but he'd be penniless, powerless, and alone. And just like that, he was erased from my life.